Okay, so the recording has started, so share my screen. And I'd like to do it the same way I did last time. I'd like to have this up so I can see who's there. Are you guys seeing this?
Yes, sir.
Yep, that's
Yes,
clear
sir.
enough. Yeah. All right, so did anybody get a chance to go through the 112 slides of did anybody go through it at all before?
Yes, sir. But I was last week. This week I
No,
was
no.
busy with assignment.
So you looked at chapter 2
Yeah.
a little bit. All right, cool. No worries. At least there's one of you. The idea is that we have a discussion about it, but we will start going through and um we'll see where we go from it. All right. So the chapter we're dealing with here is the changing nature of leadership. And it starts with the concept that a lot of people look at leadership as something that they want to get to, like some sort of prize, right? So here we're talking about perceptions of leadership and perception of leaders. So obviously, if people look at something at becoming the leader or manager in an organization as an objective, then sometimes what you're going to find happening is the behavior of the individual when they arrive in an office like that begins to change a bit. And that leads to people having reactions to those leaders. And one of the things that you're going to find is a lot of people don't like the managers. Oftentimes they can't stand the person that's in the management chair. And other times you have people who are very reverent of the leader, almost as if there's some sort of God complex, which just serves to add to the nonsense that takes place when people oftentimes find themselves in position of leadership. Now, the quotation from James Byrne here is leadership is one of the most observed but yet least understood phenomena on earth. And I found that to be quite true. Despite that, you'd find that it's one of the areas that has been studied and researched by lots of people to try and provide a lot of understanding of how to go about doing it, resulting in the emergence of a whole host of different um, training programs and textbooks and all types of things that come up. Some of these some of these you might be familiar with. For example, the leadership experience down here is one of the texts we're going to be utilizing along. Well, I didn't put the cover of the other one on it, but some of you all are aware of these. Have seen these leadership textbooks or programs. I actually did the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I did that program. I did another program too, the Leadership Challenge. That was another text that we had gone through in terms of leadership. So I did leadership training a number of times. Um, and the idea is that it's probably one of the most observed and studied, but sometimes least understood phenomenons in the world, and that's what we're looking at here. Now, how does our society treat with leadership? It Because of the plethora of different activities that leaders get up to, getting a single definition for leadership is very difficult, which is why leadership means different things to different people. And therefore, given the different contexts we find leaders in, or the different environments we find leaders in, we have just as many people who view leadership, we have just as many perceptions and views and definitions of it. So the question that we start off here by asking is, what is your perception of leadership? And how do you, now it's not something I'm going to ask you to answer in class, but it's something that you should really sit down and think about. How do you look at leadership in the context of the environments that you have experienced? Leadership in the classroom, leadership in your home, leadership in your job. for those of you who work leadership in society, leadership in the country, leadership in the world, that type of stuff. How do you look at these things and how do you perceive people in leadership positions? Some people, as I said, look at leaders as being in a situation of awe, right? Now, one of the biggest things that we always ask our leaders is we want our leaders to help us treat with the issues that we're facing us. I mean, for the last couple of weeks and probably going into October, we have been experiencing, for example, a great deal of heat, all right? And the concept here or the idea is that, Ms. Russell, welcome. The idea here is we have a situation of global change that's taking place, but yet still, you know, we have our leaders don't seem to be able to get a handle on it, because we are looking towards our leadership to help provide solutions to the problems that we face. So I've listed here a couple of the issues that we face, you know, climate change, globalization, poverty, access to healthcare, education, and other public services that we find critical for our basic survival. What else do you consider is a big issue that you'd like us to be, that you wanted the leaders to address? Anybody? What comes to mind for Trinidad for our circumstances?
Crime.
Crime, we're good. Public safety, that's what that refers to. Anything else? I know crime is a big ticket one that we have to deal with, especially if it's sitting in front of us all the time. All right, cool, no problem. So one of the things that happens though is that when we have leaders in positions and they don't seem to find or create avenues for solutions, we oftentimes get very distrustful of our leaders, and we don't appreciate them, and we look at them as failures. And that attitude or that response, which is not unfair to think that way, because oftentimes our leaders are incapable of finding solutions to these broad problems that we face. And they sort of like throw their hands up. I mean, we can't do anything about it, so and so. What happens though is that it creates something that the textbook refers to as the anti-leadership vaccine, meaning that people who are probably the most likely to be able to find solutions for us become less willing to take on the responsibility and challenges of leadership, because the society doesn't trust leaders anymore. And that anti-trust or distrust of leadership creates a problem in itself. And the experience of sitting in a leadership position can become so frustrating that people just can't wait to get the hell out. All right. And that's a problem, because it means that in a lot of instances, the people who are best suited for leadership absent themselves from offering themselves up in those positions, simply because they don't want the headache of the type of activities that go on. So for example, most leaders have a problem with their private life coming under a lot of purview or a lot of scrutiny by individuals in society, and every little thing that they've done gets challenged and criticized and compared with. So there's a lack of privacy in relation to their day-to-day activities, which, I mean, if you think about it from the perspective of somebody like actors, for example, who are constantly bombarded by the paparazzi investigating them, trying to take photographs of them in all walks of life. You can understand if you had people attacking you like that, and you know, trying to expose you for something that you didn't even do, then you'd get an idea of what some people, how some people feel about getting involved in the leadership process, because that's the kind of scrutiny that a lot of people operate under. Because you remember, when you're in that leadership chair or that position, a lot of people come to you, will come to you and criticize and will argue with you and will want to tell you how to do the job, because most of us figure, we could do a better job than the person who's actually there. But the fact of the matter is that you weren't willing to put yourself up for the challenge. So after the fact, you can't come there after the fact and then want to try and take a role up because you weren't there in the first place. Again, that is especially in broad leadership activities. You have to kind of be able to put yourself up there. But what ends up happening is that because of that type of negativity, it discourages a lot of people from wanting to take up that particular challenge. All right. So the amount of research and study that's taken place in leadership, we can probably put to rest a lot of the misconceptions that exist there in terms of what leadership is and how it works, and what we understand in terms of the way in which it's practiced. All right. So one of the first things we would be looking at, for example, is that leadership in a social movement is a different type of leadership practice than what you find practiced in the classroom and what you find practiced in an office or an organization, business organization, because the context in which leadership is practiced changes the nature of the leadership that has to be utilized, the type of techniques and activities that you get up to. So, for example, in a classroom setting, there will be the use of more authoritarian type of activities, simply because you're dealing with, especially when you're dealing with children, then there's a certain level of discipline that has to be maintained in the classroom setting. In an office environment, there's less discipline and more motivation working with it. Whereas in the social background, or if you're in a social movement, it's more about envisioning and sharing visions and motivating people to want to make transitions into something new. So those are the kind of things that you're going to find when we start to look at it. So some myths about leadership. Leaders are born, not made. Leadership is hierarchical, and you need to hold a formal position, have status and power to be considered a leader. You have to have charisma to be an effective leader. There is one standard way of leading. It is impossible to be a manager and a leader at the same time, and you only need to have common sense to be an effective leader. So what are the truths now in relationship to that? Leaders are made, not born. The fact of the matter is that even though we may come across the concept of people having what is called the so-called leadership gene, the fact of the matter is that regardless of your walk of life, your background, the environment, you still require a training to be able to bring those things together to be able to become an effective leader. So their innate characteristics or their genetic predispositions that they come with is not the only thing that will help to make them into a good leader. The environment in which they grow up will influence their leadership skills and their interests, and of course, the amount of formal training that they receive. So this is why we're saying that leadership is a skill that you can learn in relation to the inherent advantages that you're born with, or characteristics that you have as you're born with, and the environment that you go in. So the idea here now is that the first and most obvious thing about leadership is that leaders are made, they're not born. All right. Leadership occurs at all levels. It doesn't only occur in one place. The more progressive the organization is, the more people get involved in the leadership decision-making roles, which means that throughout large organizations, lots of people have decision-making power. And that helps because, remember, we said in the working smarter, one of the things is collectively smarter. More of us, we are smarter than one. So when you have more people helping to run an organization, you're utilizing the perception, skills, and training and experiences of all those peoples to help to be able to make better and more informed decisions, so that at all levels of organizations, and depending upon where you work, you might actually start to experience this, because at one level you would have the executive, then another level you would have the management team, then on top of that you might have another departmental management, various aspects or levels of management throughout the organization. So there are opportunities for leadership positions throughout organizational activities. There may not be that case, for example, in a classroom setting, though a good lecturer would set up groups, and in each group there's the opportunity for group leaders to emerge. You have that happening with in most learning environments. You have the opportunities for those types of techniques to be utilized, depending upon the nature of the stuff that you're dealing with. Similarly, in social organizations that are looking, you have section leaders or chapters and that type of stuff that can be utilized to allow for leadership practice throughout the entire thing. So I think in church groupings, for example, they utilize the concept of youth, junior pastor, youth pastors, that type of stuff. I'm not sure if you all have that. Anybody has that kind of experience from this class, where you're involved in any kind of organization that has multiple levels of management throughout the organization? Anybody? Nobody?
Yeah, in church, some Christian churches,
Right.
it
Some
has
church,
youth leaders though.
right? Okay. Okay. All right, cool. All right, so charisma is not a prerequisite for leaders. Now, although charisma might be a useful tool, it is a dangerous tool. And it is not a prerequisite for you to be a leader. Charismatic leaders have, as the quotation here, profound and unusual effect on followers. They are seen as visionaries who can have strong desires for power and can easily motivate others. However, many accomplished leaders are not described as charismatic, and for every positive charismatic example seen, negative ones exist. And there's an interesting quotation here from Mr. Drucker, Peter Drucker. For any of you who do management studies, Drucker is one of those people. The three most charismatic leaders in this century, and he was talking about the 20th century, inflicted more suffering on the human race than almost any trio in history: Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. What matters is not the leader's charisma. What matters is the leader's mission. So we have a section on mission and vision and that type of stuff. So we've met Hitler and Stalin in the previous chapter. Anybody's familiar with Mao? When he says Mao, Chairman Mao?
Yeah, I think he's the founder of the Communist Party in China.
He used to be, yes. Chairman Mao was the leader and the founder, correct, of the People's Republic of China. And during their reigns, they created a lot of so the Mao style of leadership in China is dramatically different to the style of leadership that exists now in China, where but they're still based upon that same concept of the party in front of everything. But of course, Mao had lots of problems arriving at the position he was in, and lots of people died because of the mistakes that he made. There was what they referred to as the Long March, in which millions of people died from starvation because they didn't plan properly. They didn't have enough food. The whole concept of isolationists, that type of stuff. So, but the good thing in that sense is that they learned from the mistakes that they made in the past. So now China is probably one of the largest food manufacturing places to be able to feed themselves. But of course, their population is so large, they have to buy a lot of their food from outside still, because they're unable to, meet all of the needs and wants of their society. So these are charismatic leaders that I've had. We've talked about Hitler before, and we've also talked about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They were both very charismatic. Little well known is Mahatma Gandhi. This gentleman here was also seen as very charismatic. Anybody knows this gentleman here? With the
Yes,
shades?
That is the guy who had it called Jim Jones.
Yes, the Right Reverend Jim Jones. Everybody's familiar with him and the backstory for him, or the story about him.
So that is
Besides, besides Keats, Constantine. Besides Nathan, Constantine, go ahead.
I'm trying to remember. I think he went to
Constantine, not
some
hearing you.
party. I remember that he
Keep your mic
was
on.
some
I could clicked off there.
to
Nicholas, you wanted to
Clement?
add something?
No, sir.
You sure? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Chad.
Yeah, I was saying that he poisoned his congregation.
Well, he didn't. It wasn't only the congregation. He took his own Kool-Aid as well. Yes, but that mass suicide, and you'd think that the people that followed Jim Jones were, illiterate people, but the people that they most found were young professionals who were basically at when he started his program, he kind of piggybacked on the radical thinking, free love situation that was taking place back then. But then people who were displaced in society, young Black professionals, young immigrants who were being ostracized in the American society, he provided a space for them to operate in, but then started to sort of, what's the word I want to use? Brainwash them into believing certain concepts and ideas about himself and the movement that he had in moving things forward. It was, if you ever read the story or look at not read, but you can also look at documentaries, you can see the whole process of how he got to the case or the place that he was. And he suffered from a kind of self-delusion and paranoia that eventually led to the feeling that he felt persecuted, which is why they ended up in Guyana. And it was at the Guyana compound that they had the whole issue taking place, where he in Jonestown, where the mass suicides took place, including children of the people who were there. It was really, I think, a number of docudramas have been set up in relation to it. You could probably have a look at it on television, see how they deal with that. Okay, so moving forward again, there's not one right way to lead. And we can see this from examples of various forms of leadership styles that we may have experienced in our own life. Different people lead differently based upon a lot of the influences in their life. So their gender, their cultural identity, their personal value systems, all those things impact upon the way in which they go about leading. And therefore, what becomes more important is not the individual, but more the context in which they're practicing their leadership kind of determines what would work in which situation. So, for example, if you are a teacher and you're always teaching young children, there's a danger that when you go into another scenario or another context or a different organization, you can't use the school type leadership techniques that you were utilizing in the classroom to work with a group of adults. So you'd have to make adjustments to it. So the context helps to determine the type of leadership. So there is no one way to do anything. There's a multitude of methodologies that can be utilized to be effective in the context that you're working in. So that's another thing. Yes, you can be a manager and a leader simultaneously. What you have to pay attention to in terms of the variation between management and leadership is that management is focused on the objectives of the organization, primarily about profit making, whereas leadership is about motivating people within the organization to do the things that you want to get done. So oftentimes you'd find that though a manager is concerned with output, they have to spend some time working in terms of motivation and encouraging their staffing or their subordinates to be able to do the things they want to get done. Treating with, sitting down in an office and listen to somebody, who comes in and they want to chat about problems that they're having and, helping to detox them and that kind of stuff. Those are the kind of things that are leadership in nature. Managerial will be, making decisions about, a time schedule or a change in activity or passing along some sort of information that helps to move the organization forward. So there's a combination. What we need to do or understand is that the person who sits in a management position has more than one role. They have a managing role and they have a leadership role. And whenever you find yourself in an organization where you are in a leadership position, you have to distinguish between the need for you to, to look at the leadership activities you get involved with. And that's generally going to be the activities that require you shaping the nature of the relationship you're having with the people with whom you work. Not just giving them orders, so that when you develop a good relationship and you ask somebody that, or you indicate to somebody this has to be done, that has to be done. It's not a matter of yelling at them and telling them that they have to do it. It's because you've already developed a relationship. So when you talk to them, listen, we need to get XYZ done. I'd like you to work on this to get this thing sorted out. And you open up that exchange. You've given an instruction, but you haven't given it in such a way that the person feels slighted by your behavior and by your treatment of them. So that's the nature of blending the two that a manager has to treat with. The fact that there are management objectives to be met and leadership activities that need to be put in place to be able to achieve those things. So there's a distinction between the two. Managers, as we said, as I talked about, they're bound to the organization and what they need to do, and they are always preoccupied by doing it the way in which the organization wants it, whereas leaders are focused on doing the right thing. So sometimes there's a dichotomy or a division between the two, that the firm would like it done in one way, but the right thing that a leader would normally want to choose to do is not necessarily going to coincide. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but there's a gap between the two. So there's something that we have to pay attention there in terms of how managers and leaders work. All right, because a manager will come outside and yell at somebody and say, hey, so and so, get that done. A leader, no. A leader will come and talk to you and privately work with you and that kind of stuff and encourage you to get things done. There are two different ways of doing things, right? Russell's coming back in again. Welcome back, Russell. All right. So obviously there's an overlap between the two sets of activities, and what you can do is measure the amount of time you spend on each of them, so that you'd recognize that not all the time you're working on managerial tasks, but you're also working on leadership tasks. So you have to find a balance between the two, and you have to know when each type of activity is required. That's something that as a leader and as a manager, you're going to have to work on. Leadership is teachable. So as we talked about before, leadership is something that you have the opportunity to develop. So therefore, the skills of leadership are teachable, just like any other skill that's out there. It's about, being willing to develop the capacity and focusing on trying to get it done. Remember those three things we talked about: your will, your focus, and your capacity. If you're lacking some elements of or some skills, then it's not the end of the world. You can develop those skills through training. And once you are willing to do it and you put some focus into it, all right, you should be able to get yourself going through that process and learning the leadership. Now, it's up to you, all right, to get it done. But the whole point about it is that once you're willing to do it, take the risks and focus, you could develop the things, because nobody became a great leader overnight. Let's put it that way. Leadership is about developing skills through a process of, mistakes and successes. Some things you do right, some things you don't. All right, so it's a little beyond common sense. All right, now one of the issues that came up was defining what leadership was. So a little backstory into the leadership thing. The term leader can be traced back in the English language to about the 1300s. The word leadership didn't emerge until the 1800s and was only used in the context of political situations. Formal definitions begin to emerge between the 1900s to the 1929. So you have to think about what's going on back in those periods to understand where some of these definitions will come from. So by the 1980s, you had about 110 definitions created primarily in the field of academia. Most of them can be found of those things in scholarly publications, those academic papers that you'd see, and at least 366 publications on leadership that did not include formal definitions of the term. So for a very long time, the concept of a leader leadership wasn't fully defined for a long period of time. So we'd see different people try to start to define them. So 1906, 1907, Mumford decided he worked on this preeminence of one or a few individuals in a group in the process of control of societal phenomena. So in essence, what Mumford is talking about here is the master of puppets definition. Preeminence of one or a few people over a group. So the leader is in control of an event and exhibits this control through his control of the people. So leadership leaders were given this kind of bad rap because they were seen as these puppet masters kind of thing going on. Or the wizard in the back room, for those of you who might be familiar with the Wizard of Oz definition or portrayal. All right. Contemporary definitions of leadership look at leadership as the relational process involved in getting things done. So the definition we had was that leadership is about working together with other people with utilizing ethical values to be able to achieve certain goals. Another aspect is that there's a level of interaction between leaders and followers who work together to accomplish this. So this last one here, this definition here, is more in line with what we've been looking at in terms of the definition coming from the program that we're looking at. So different organizations or different fields, we looked at this already, looked at definitions that suited their circumstances, and of course now we have to also look at how they interrelated with each other. If we look from one background or one field of study into another field of study, how do they correlate with each other in terms of how the definitions would work? So clearly having any one formal definition has to be able to cover leadership in all different contexts, which makes the definition rather difficult to really find. So obviously we understand that there is no one correct definition of leadership. Therefore, it asks what therefore is leadership going to be, and how does it best work? So the whole concept or idea that's coming out of this part is that when you look at the definition of leadership, or how you're going to go about defining, it really depends upon what context you're looking at the leadership working in. So as I said before, if you move from one environment to another, the definitions of the leadership will change based upon the context in which it's going to be working. So in the political sphere, there's a definition that will be managerial or business sphere. In the social movements, in your family, there's going to be a different type of leadership that works there. In the classroom, there's a different type of leadership and therefore a different type of definition. So the idea is that the definition will automatically begin to vary based upon the context in which the person is practicing their leadership activities. Now, in order to try and make some of these definitions work a little better, they started to use the metaphorical methodology of defining. So you have a metaphor being created to try and clear up what they're talking about here. So you have the competitive market metaphor, the consensus metaphor, the administrative metaphor, the anarchy metaphor, independent judiciary, the plebiscitary, autocratic metaphor, the collective bargaining method, the democratic. So basically what these are phrases or concepts that they put down and say, okay, let's think about the consensus metaphor. What is leadership functioning there? How does that work? Well, that's the person who's able to get consensus by getting the majority of people to agree with a particular point of view. That's consensus. All right. The democratic leader or the democratic metaphor down here is talking about elections. Hey, whoops, let me just undo that. Right. So in the democratic metaphor, you have a situation where it's about, you know, how many people you can get to vote for you. Collective bargaining is about how much pressure you can put together or put down to be able to force a decision on another person by simply the strength of your collective bargaining power. The more persons that you represent, the stronger your thing. Now, of all of these, one of the metaphors that appealed to the author and myself as well was the metaphor of leadership in the context of music. Let's see if we get. Hi, Stephanie. Welcome. Stefania, sorry, Stephanie. Right. So we have a common contemporary metaphor likens leadership to an orchestra or symphony. So if we think about a symphony, who do we see there who's in a leadership position? This is a picture of an orchestra in action. Who's the leader there, supposedly?
The conductor.
Right? Is he playing anything?
No.
Nope. He have a stick. That's not a musical instrument as far as I know, unless he was tapping it on something, all right, to make a sound. But he's given that position, and he even has a little rostrum so that he's higher than everybody else. And he's given that position of leadership. So let's observe this. This person, Dupree, he broke down the metaphor to, rather than the orchestra, he's using a jazz musicians. So, and then he puts this quotation up together. A jazz band leader must choose the music, find the right musicians, then perform in public. But the effect of the performance depends upon many things. The environment that you're performing in, the volunteers playing in the band, the need for everybody to perform as individuals, but in the context of working in the group, the absolute dependence of the conductor, the leader of the band, on the members of the band. Because if it's the same kind of conductor who has the stick, he's not actually doing anything. And the need for the leader, the need of the leader for the followers to play well together. That is leadership in action. All right. Now, if you think about it from that context, this is just an image of a band. So the leader might be a guy on the side playing the piano. So the piano is kind of connecting all the people together. Anybody here ever performed in a band or has a musical background? It could be a steel band as well, if you think about it from that context, because each pan has a voice, and it represents one of the things, like the bass, the tenor, the double seconds, the cellos. All of them have a different voice, and then of course you have a rhythm section to kind of hold everybody together, and then you still have a conductor for a pan side as well. So this can be utilized across the board for everybody. But if you go back to this thing here, you're choosing the music, you're finding the musicians, you're organizing the performance, you have rehearsals, and you need to go to the environment and check it out and make sure that the environment is working and you have the correct equipment and setup for that. Then you have to make sure that people who are operating in the band are actually going to be able to work in the environment, and they have to work not only as a performer for themselves, but also to work in conjunction with the other person. So you can't have. This is one of the reasons why if you have another metaphor we can use here is the sports team. Like let's say a cricket team or a football team. You can get a lot of world stars working together to play a game. But if everybody's just going to operate as a star, they would probably lose. Why do you think that would happen? You could have all these great stars in one team, but they would still lose because of what?
No coordination.
Why is there no coordination?
Because the all would kind of be doing the one thing without the conductor being there as a
Yeah, there would be a
leader. Yeah.
clear defined leadership role to tell people, okay, you work here, you work there. It's sort of like, they always talked about in Trinidad. I remember we had that Dutch coach with us at one point in time. I don't know if you all remember. This would be in 1990s. Some of you all may or may not have been born at the time. But we had a Dutch coach that was involved with what was this called then, the strike squad. And he made a statement one day in a press conference about the nature of footballers in Trinidad. He said everybody wants to be a striker, everybody want to go and score a goal, but you have other things to do. You have to defend. There's a middle field to operate in. You have a goalkeeper. All those things were important. Just as important as scoring goals is preventing goals. So he had like that everybody wanted to be everybody wanted to be the goal scorer and nobody wanted to be a defender. So I remember, and that's what happens when you have an all-star team. An all-star team, everybody wants to start. And so therefore you're less likely to be successful. So you might have a group of very gifted musicians, but gifted or not, if they're unwilling to play with each other and work with each other, you will have mass chaos and just simply noise. It would not be an enjoyable circumstance to listen to things, because you have to learn to work together, to work with each other. Nathan's having a lot of problems coming back in. All right, so the Pre's jazz leadership metaphor is powerful in illustrating inclusiveness, valuing individuality, showing the importance of the public good, empowering people to realize their gifts and talents. And it describes the emerging new role of leadership in today's organization. So this Dupree leadership metaphor is one of the more powerful ones that speaks to me, because I have a bit of a background in music. I've played music before, and I can see this working. You also have the sports metaphor that I also utilize as well. If you have a team, any kind of team where you have all these people working, coming together, you're still going to need somebody to take charge, which is one of the reasons why all teams have a captain, and the teams require captains to be able to streamline and coordinate the activities of the organization. All right. See Nathan like he's stuck. It's a long time to be trying to get in. All right. Okay, so let's move along here now. All right, so we talked a lot about the metaphor. So as I said before, this presentation is not set up for presenting issues. Let's see if he got him. Did he? Nope. Let's hope he comes back again. So Ross in 1993, he used another metaphor as leadership as an episodic affair, meaning that leaders don't lead every minute of every day. They lead in specific episodes. So if you think about this from the position of somebody who's a manager in an office, not everything they do is leadership oriented. You know, when they're sitting in the office working on stuff on their own, they're not acting in a leadership capacity, they're acting in a managerial capacity. So hi Nathan, you okay? It doesn't seem like your mic's working. Right? So Ross referred to this in 1993 as a episodic issue. So it's time specific, place specific, context specific. So if you're in an office situation, when you call a meeting, that will definitely be a time frame in which you're going to be acting in a leadership position. So you're coordinating a meeting to get to meet some objectives. That is definitely some sort of leadership activity. But when you're in the office writing up a report or doing a memo, something like that, that's not necessarily going to be you operating in the context of leadership. So this is where Ross refers to it as a episodic type of leadership activity, which makes sense. I mean, that's the nature of how it's going to be dealing with it. So that's good enough. Now, so in general, leadership is a very complex concept. It's elusive in the sense that it's hard to pin down because, let's put it this way, it's almost like leadership is not tangible. You can't touch leadership, but you can see it when it's happening. It's not something you could grab a hold of and pull it apart and that kind of stuff. It's a type of behavioral activity that's, you know, synonymous with mist. You see it, but you can't go and grab it and hold it. So that's an interesting metaphor that I use there in terms of leadership. Is just this very, you can see it, but you can't touch it, you can't hold it. It's a kind of mirage of something that's sitting there in front of you that has to be dealt with. So initially, leadership was thought to be very straightforward and simple, and that was one of the things that one of the reasons why a lot of people talked about leadership being common sense. Though there may be common sense involved, it's not necessarily going to be that easy to be dealing with. So because it's a very complex, as they refer to it here, Van Fleet and Nagel, it's a very complex social phenomenon that allows one individual to allow another individual to make decisions that impact upon them. And why and how that happens is what we're going to be looking at. The leadership field has a lot of studies, and some of it is good and some of it is bad, and we're going to be looking at those things. So we're going to be looking at the emergence of the leadership theories that we're going to be trying to go through, and that's what we're going to spend the rest of the evening here looking at all these theories and how they approach, they started and how they move forward, that type of stuff. All right, so let's look at the great man approach. These theories preceded something called the traits approach, right? So the great man approach was based upon Darwinistic thinking, which dominated the overall thinking pattern in the early 19th century, based upon the assumption that leadership is based upon hereditary properties. Now, anybody knows what the Darwinist thinking was overall? Everybody knows the theory of evolution from Darwin? That man evolved from apes and that kind of stuff. Because we know now it's not as simple. But that concept was that the great man theory is a theory that sits upon the concept that people had to inherit their position through the context of genetics. So great people bred great people kind of thing. So it was only based upon so and you could actually see this taking place, because if you think about the monarch system of leadership, it was based upon your parentage. So it'll go from the leadership will travel from father to son. You understand what I mean? Father to son to the next son and so on. So going back along the line of most of the you call that thing, the hereditary of that individual, you see a whole long line of these individuals all coming from one family that was based upon that hereditary idea. And it was that they arrived or got themselves into positions of leadership based upon who was the strongest. So great man theory is based upon brothers of reigning kings who are ascribed to have abilities of power and influence, and was believed that by intermarriage of the fittest could produce an aristocratic class superior than the lower class. So that was the whole concept behind the great man theory, that at some point in time, somebody rose into power and that particular group of individuals reigned as the king. What about great women? So in history, great women such as Joan of Arc and Catherine the Great were ignored as anomalies. So women weren't supposed to be leaders. Let's talk about this quickly, because the great man theory is the great man theory. It's not a misnomer. Because at that point in time, women were not considered as appropriate or equal leaders as men. All right, so yeah, unfortunately, we're going to have to deal with the very some very difficult truths as we're dealing with time here. Okay, so the theory, therefore, ascribed only that men will be great leaders, one, and the only way you can be a leader is if you came from the line of the family that allowed for it. It caused a lot of intermarry. Now, what happens when you intermarry or inbreed? What happens to people when they inbreed? Anybody here has a sorry? What happens?
Mental and physical issues.
Yes, you start to get your bloodline begins to weaken because you're inbreeding, so that you're too close to each other, and therefore it starts to create problems. One being mental, and then you also start to have physical disabilities that begin to show up. And lots of the families of the aristocratic class have these kind of problems that they kind of hide from the wider society, but obviously it comes up as a. But again, let's think about it. This is the thinking back then. And why was that the thinking back then? Because the ruling concept of modern thought at that point in time was the concept that evolution was the primary driver behind it. So that also led to this approach here, another theory, the traits approach. So the great man theory gave way to the trait theory that said that they emerged, people who emerged as leaders had a list of known traits or characteristics that showed them to be leaders. So it was assumed that leaders had such traits as a particular level of intelligence, they had to be of a particular height, and they have to be self-confident. And what they're not talking about here is the other list. They had to be blonde. First of all, they had to be Caucasian or white. They had to be blue-eyed. They had to be blonde. All right. And the problem is that they could not come up with a combination of these traits that actually proved itself to be related, because Hitler wasn't blue-eyed and blonde. Stalin wasn't blue-eyed and blonde. Hitler wasn't very tall either. So you understand what I'm talking about. So they tried to put these physical traits together that should indicate who would be a leader. And we see it a lot. We see it in movies as well. You see these people are portrayed as leaders, and each leader has a particular set of very similar traits that the screen likes to see. You know, they have a particular body build. They have a particular type of hair. It doesn't matter, regardless of whether we look at the past or the present. You'd start to see a set of commonalities in behavioral patterns and so on. Again, this theory would fail because there wasn't a way to actually produce a provable list of these particular things. And of course, with the trait theory and the great man theory falling apart, it then moved us into behavioral theories. And the first behavioral approach that we start to look at was, well, we had a couple of them. Basically, behavioral approaches started to observe or try to use observational methodologies to look at capturing what makes a good leader. All right. So it related the context of managerial activities, rules, functions, and responsibility, and it started to kind of do a kind of checklist kind of thing. They define people as being effective and ineffective leaders by comparing how often they engage in particular types of behaviors, and as opposed to other types of behaviors. Historically, the field of psychology largely influenced the studies of the behavioral field. So, you know, remember we talked about psych and soc, but this is primarily psychology is driving the beginning of behavioral theories that we were looking at. Okay. All right. So again, 50s and 60s. So coming out of the 50s and 60s. Now, prior to that, remember we had the great man theory and the traits approach, right? Now, for those of you who might be familiar with this, in the period of the great man theories, which was the end of the 19th century, coming up to World War II, the idea coming out of Darwinistic thinking as well was eugenics. Anybody's familiar with that concept of idea, what eugenics is? It's related to genetic studies, but the eugenics was the concept that there's specific genes that help to determine whether you'd be successful or not, or whether you would have a particular thing. Eugenics also saw that there were a lot of genes that were not desirable, and that was also utilized to justify slavery. Eugenics was also utilized in that particular thing. So, and it played a role too in World War I and II, World War II in particular with Hitler, because the studies in eugenics was utilized to try and justify the actions of Hitler in terms of the eradication and the Holocaust activities that he got involved in, because what they were doing was systematically removing from the world the genes that they saw as being negative for the human race, and to breed the Aryan race that they were looking for. So I know this might sound a little upsetting, but eugenics is something that is partially responsible, or was the thinking behind a lot of those things that came out of Darwinistic thinking. So now we're on to where psychology is now being used. So here you have to think about the great Sigmund Freud, who came up with his approach to how the id and that type of stuff. All of those things now are looking at observing the behaviors of people who are leaders and trying to figure out, okay, this is an effective leader. What is that leader doing? Or how does that leader behave in order to make him successful? So again, here now they're just primarily focusing on the leader themselves. Again, 50s and 60s, this is the age of industrialization. So picture, if you can, a guy in a lab coat with a clipboard, and he's writing notes. He's observing the a lab coat and a clipboard, and he's taking note of the things that he's seeing that the manager is doing, and giving a tick or a check and that kind of stuff to check and see what's going on. So yeah, these two universities that produce two managerial techniques. So they produced this two-dimensional thing here. They said the actions that the managers would get into are actions of consideration and actions of initiating structure. So basically, consideration was described as the degree to which the actor acts in a friendly and supportive manner towards the subordinate, whereas initiating is the degree to which the leader does something that works towards achieving the objective of the organization. So organizational focus as opposed to people focus. So the two dimensions are independent of each other. So scores can vary between each in either positive or negative. So either they did good things or they did negative things. It didn't matter. You had to behave in a particular way. So in essence, this is why I say, picture in your mind a guy with a checkboard, a clipboard with a lab coat, glasses, and a pencil, and he's jotting down these initiating structure behaviors and these consideration behaviors. So he probably has a checkboard set up in with two matrices in it, or two columns, and he's writing down or doing checklist. And he's looking at, it doesn't matter, you say it doesn't matter if the action is positive or negative. So there's no distinction with if he did something that was negative, like he cuss up somebody, or if he encouraged somebody. It didn't matter, as long as they fell into behaviors of consideration and those behaviors of initiating structure. All right, so those are the kind of things that they would observing. Obviously, what's well, we'll look at that. So the Blake and Morton proposed another method called concern for people and concern for production. It's the same thing, basically. Actions that they looked at that exhibited concern for the individuals in the organization, as opposed to actions and activities that concerned output and production. So again, you're simply observing what were effective managers doing and what were ineffective managers doing. The research concluded this: effective managers showed high concern for people and production. What does that mean? All right. So Michigan Studies on Leadership, they came up with these three types of behaviors. You had task-oriented behaviors, relation-oriented behaviors, and participative leadership behaviors. Wow. So now we've gone from bimodal now to trimodal. So there are three different things that they can do. Task-oriented will obviously be those that are organizational and designed to achieve the organizational tasks. Relationship would be about the behaviors that would be related to the development or impact upon the relationship between the leader, the manager, and the staff. And participative leadership behaviors will be those where they allow discourse between the both parties. So what did that, right? So those were the things that they were trying to observe. So at the end of the day, what started to happen? First of all, the behavioral approaches they offered were very simplistic in nature. Leadership, we already know from our own understanding of it, is that it's complicated, and therefore trying to minimize the observations into two and three different categories of information obviously created a problem, because you couldn't just you could not explain complex activities in the context of a bimodal type of measurement technique that was going on there. So most of the results that came out from these types of things were simply inconclusive and obviously inconsistent, because the situation was ignored. Because a lot of this was taking place in the industrial revolution, or during the industrial revolution, where you started to have factories being set up and that type of stuff. So they didn't take into consideration the impact of the actual process itself. All right. So obviously, with those theories, behavioral theories, having problems, then we had to move on to something else. So now we had situational contingency approaches. So this approach proposed that leaders should vary their approaches or their behaviors based upon the context or the situation. So, right. So now we start to say, okay, the other theories ignored the situation. So now situational contingent approaches will put the situation into the mix and try to observe what was going on. The situation determined who will emerge as the leader being the product of the situation. So now we're going cart before horse kind of situation here now. We're saying, okay, so the situation is going to determine the leader, but you're going into the situation where a leader is already determined. So I don't understand what they were trying to do here. How do the effects of leadership? So the main question they asked was, how do the effects of leadership vary from situation to situation? So contingency theory incorporated situational moderators, variables to explain leadership effectiveness. It emphasized that leadership behavior cannot be explained in a vacuum, and that the circumstances must be included. So, all right, so they came to an interesting conclusion in terms of contingency theory. So you couldn't identify the behaviors unless you put it in the context of the situation. So what theories came up? You had the least preferred worker, LPC model, developed in the mid-60s, and it described how the situation moderates the relationship between the leader's traits and effectiveness. So basically what is trying to say here now is the model was making the circumstances or situation help to modify the relationship between the two. All right, so what else? The second, the part goal theory originated in 1957. So again, this is the midst of the Industrial Revolution. All right, so this one looked at the easiest path to attaining personal goals. All right, so it meant that what they found the task of the leader to be was to increase the personal rewards to subordinates for the performance in order to make the paths to their goals clearer and easier. So it's path to attain personal goals, and they'll tend to be higher producers. So basically what this is the beginning of if we could think about it from the concept of, if you are achieving your personal goals of be it income levels, money, whatnot, and in achieving those goals, you are also obtaining the goals of the organization. What we're really talking about there is kind of like motivational theory. So that in order for a manager to be successful, he has to make subordinates want to do the work because it coincides with their personal goals of getting better incomes and getting the outcomes that they want. So once they get those outcomes, you'll also get the other one. So the job of the leader in this context would be to make sure that there's a big overlap between the two. that the personal goals of the subordinates and the institutional goals and output had to overlap with each other so that they will get high production. All right. So that's where you get bonuses and task-oriented work coming up. So that people in once you get those kind of bonuses for motivational purposes, then you'll get people doing more in the sense of producing. So they come into a plant and you say, okay, all right, once you hit 1,000 items for the day, you get an additional $100 for the day, kind of, you know, that kind of motivational theory, which of course is extrinsic motivational theory. So look at that. So again, concerns about these theories of leadership include a lack of supporting research, because obviously they had to go out there and try and find organizations that use that contingency approach. And there was a unclear association between the commitment and the competencies of subordinates and their levels of development. So the correlation between the two events would be, the connection between the two wasn't very clear. And therefore, again, these theories would kind of fall apart because they lacked the necessary evidence to prove that, okay, this theory kind of explains what's going on. So in essence, you have to remember two things about theories. Theories are coming up after the fact. So you already have successful plants running, successful managers out there, or supposedly successful. And what you're trying to do is to try and find out, well, what is this manager doing, or that manager doing, or this person doing, or not doing, as the case might be, in relation to what's going on. So remember, they started with looking only at what the manager was doing. Now they're looking at what the manager is doing plus the contingency theory, and then they started to try and blend all together. So you have this whole type of activity kind of going on. But again, you have to remember the context of what's happening here. Businesses are already running, firms already exist, people are already being lauded as great leaders. But what classified them as that? The theory is trying to explain what is already taking place around us. All right, so that brings us into the influence theories. So there were two periods in which influence theory started to really grow, in 1924 and 1947. Well, we will see the context. And Max Weber, or Max Weber, depending upon who you want, he used the term charisma in a managerial context to describe the form of influence based not on traditional power or formal authority, but rather on follower perceptions that the leader is endowed with exceptional qualities. Now, the reason why 1924 and 1947 are very important is that both of them were coming out of periods after wars in which countries fought wars in relation to the rise of a charismatic leader within those countries, and both of them coming from Germany, by the way. Just the Kaiser in the 1920s and Hitler in the 1930s to 40s. All right. So again, you have a situation here now where leaders are supposedly endowed with these exceptional qualities that allow them, through their charisma, to convince people to go and do something like fight a war, but not necessarily based upon observing what their skills and so on. So influence theory really tried to focus its attention on charismatic leadership. That study wasn't really formalized until 1977, when Robert House, proposed the formal theory of charismatic leadership would be explained by a set of testable variables. Now, this is the claim that Robert House is making. All right, charisma is attributed to leaders by their followers. Now, and this is what is dangerous about charisma. You can't say you have charisma. You could claim it, but you can't say you have charisma. What proves that somebody has charisma is the people who follow. They would tell you that somebody is charismatic. So that's why if I ask you, are you charismatic? I can't believe you for the simple reason that you're not the person who's going to see the charisma in action. The person who I have to talk to are the members of an organization. Is your leader charismatic? And they would tell you, because charisma is a very personal experience. You would know, I don't know if you've ever experienced being with somebody who is charismatic in nature. There is an emotional response that somebody has to the individual. And now it based upon maybe what they look like, what they sound like, how they move, how they address people. And that becomes problematic because what he also observed is that charismatic leadership tends to become the critical tip in decision making for followers when there are challenges in the nature of how things are going on. So when the status quo is being challenged, what you have is charismatic leaders encouraging people to do certain things without even they knowing that they're being encouraged to do it. All right. So this is where he talks about it posits that the conditions that facilitate charismatic leadership includes times of crisis and times when followers are willing to challenge the status quo. So this is where you kind of get a mob rules effect taking place. You have a leader who's speaking about things that they agree about. He's charismatic because he's encouraging and exciting people to think and move along that direction. And that then creates the problem or the situation where people are willing to then pick up arms and move forward with it. So the issue that you're coming across here now is the fact that see this part here, too much deference to individual leaders by followers creates a dangerous circumstance where leaders misuse their power or deliver a vision with an empty dream. Now, we thought this theory was really posited in and around Hitler and the Kaiser, Mussolini, and these guys. But we also have to think about this in smaller individuals. So if you think about Jim Jones, this is what's happening within his. He is speaking to a group of individuals who already feel a sense of disenfranchisement, and they are looking for an answer to the problem. Because remember, again, we are always looking for leaders to help us solve the problems that we have. So these professionals, young professionals working or trying to find a living, they feel out of place in the America that existed at that point in time. And Jim Jones comes to them and offers a solution. And the way in which he goes about delivering it. Think about I don't know if any of you all ever look at those those evangelists preaching church evangelist people. You all understand what we're talking about here? Any of you all ever
Yes.
look at Benny Hinn and those kind of guys? The way in which the audience responds to them, it's like they're in a world by themselves and everybody's just gonna follow what they say. And that's the kind of response that was taking place within the context of that meeting or that grouping of individuals. So you have a whole set of almost cult-like following that's taking place. And if there's enough momentum and it captures many people's point of view, then you're going to have situations in which it becomes dangerous. Because here you have, in the case of Hitler and the case of Mussolini and the case of the you had people who were able to motivate a particular group of individuals, enough individuals, to move a country into world wars. Have we had that type of level of charismatic leadership since? Not enough to take us into a war, because I think now it's a little more difficult because anybody who gets up and begins to speak is speaking to an international audience. The audience is not just a small group of individuals. But then again, if we think about how ISIS works and that type of stuff. They work in isolated pieces, and they're able to convince individuals of a particular mode in of behavior and a way of life. And then when opened up to a wider scrutiny of the world, is us when we look at it, not knowing the context in which they are receiving, that group is receiving the information and the context of their lives and so on, we start to look at it and say, what wrong with these people? They're going crack. Why they can't see that, you know, what he talking about is rubbish, or this can't work in the environment. And again, it's because our environments are so much more different than people who may be living in Afghanistan or who are living in Pakistan and those places. Our environments are different. We don't understand or perceive the nature of their lives in the context of their lives, and which is why extremist behavior that we see coming up based upon people who are viewed as being charismatic, we look at them and say, this is the most despicable person I've ever seen or heard from. And that's because charismatic leaders help to work well in smaller groups and then start to widen out by almost like by referencing, you know, everybody's coming to this leader through a referencing system. And that approval rating begins to rise and rise and rise based upon that. We haven't had one of those internationally charismatic people for a good long while. Obama came close at one point in time, but then when he got into office, he started to make some decisions there that you know kind of turned a lot of people internationally off of his behavior in any case. So think about it from that perspective. All right, so those theories, of course, had problems. Again, because it only spoke to one element of leadership, the charismatic leader, and the conclusion that they drew here, or they made here, is that charismatic leadership is dangerous. At the end of the day, charisma is not the only, or should not be the only yardstick for that particular thing. So now we have the reciprocal leadership theories. This is coming up in the 1970s. So reciprocal leadership theories emerged, and it focuses on the relationship and the reciprocal nature of leader-follower interactions. So now, who can tell me what was happening in the 1970s in most of the Western world? Anybody? Yes, Nathan. See a mic coming on, but not hearing you.
Yeah,
Right,
I know.
hearing you now. Go ahead.
I know in the 1970s it was the Vietnam War. That had a
One
lot
thing,
of unrest.
very good. So actually, the Vietnam War came from the 60s into the 70s. Great. What else was taking place from a social background?
Civil rights movements and
Civil rights movement, great. What else?
feminist movements.
The what?
Different feminist movements too.
Feminist movements. What was sitting at the background of all of them?
Inequality.
No. A movement.
Social justice.
No, that's modern stuff.
Okay, I don't know.
All right.
I don't know.
How old are you, Nathan?
30.
All right. So y'all remember ever hearing something called the flower power? Hippies?
So I used to call my neighbor that because he used to make roti, you know. That's the only time I used to use that.
Flower as in FLOWER. Flower power and the hippie movement, drugs and experimenting with drugs and rock and roll and long hair and Woodstock. You all never heard about those things, right? So in the United States, during that period, you had this movement of free love and getting rid of inhibitions and moving into a lot of free expression. And, you know, we are all one and we need to work together, that type of hairy-fairy thinking. In that background, you also had the anti-war movement this is where a lot of distrust was put into the establishment. So a lot of people did not trust the establishment. Prior to that, you had the 1960s. It was in the 1960s you had the civil rights movement that went up to the 1970s. In the 1970s, the Black Power movement came up, and that was where it got more militant in nature. All right. So you had a lot of, because you had a lot of Black Americans coming back from Vietnam who were now trained with weapons, and they knew how to use guns, and they could, stand up to the white supremacist movements that existed prior to that. All right. So in the 1970s, you had the reciprocal leadership theories emerging in the context of this flower power. We are all one. We need to work together. And notice what they're talking about. It focused on the relational and reciprocal nature of leader-follower interactions. So again, we started to get, it emphasized mutual goals, motivation of both followers and leaders, elevated importance and roles of followers in the leadership. So it was, we had to do everything together. We make up the leadership. This kind of we movement. All right. And it sat on that whole concept of reciprocal leadership theory, sat upon this whole idea or ideology at that time that kind of governed things. So if you ever do a little bit of reading or a little bit of research in that period of the 1970s, you'll come across the hippie movements and the free love movements. And if you look at Forrest Gump actually covers that whole period of the 1970s and the 60s with the Beatles and Elvis Presley and all rock and roll and the Vietnam War and all that kind of stuff. It looks at America during that period, during the 1970s. Think about it. When you look at that movie, think about these theories developing in the context of that. And that's something I wanted to point out to you guys. The emergence of theories don't emerge in a vacuum. They emerge in the context of general beliefs and thoughts that govern the areas of govern the time frames in which we emerge. We'll see it come up again another time. All right. These theories posited that leadership is not just something that a leader does to followers, rather leadership is a process that meaningfully engages leaders and participants, values the contributions of the participants, shares power and authority between leaders and participants, and establishes leadership as an inclusive activity among interdependent people. In a nutshell, that is what the Flower Power movement was all about. That we don't trust these old school leaders who believe in the status quo of you are young, shut up and listen. So you had a lot of rebellious young people who wanted to be part of the leadership process and wanted to help to make decisions to move us forward, and as a country and as a world. And it had to be that we had to move together. We couldn't have one group of people making decisions and loading it over another set of people. But it had to be an interactive decision-making process where we got together and made decisions together, respecting each other and being mutually beneficial for everybody. So that's the nature of where these things. So participants are empowered to provide leadership. So therefore, this also allowed for the transition of leadership to move from the leader on to subordinate peoples. And so therefore, it allowed for participants themselves to be transferred or transformed into the leaders themselves. So it allows for growth and development. All right. So it was a big distinction from what was there. Three major theories that I explored, and we will see some of these: the transforming leadership theory, the servant leadership theory, and the followership theory. So these are all the theories that emerged during this period. In a nutshell, well, let's see. Transforming leadership theory was formulated by James McGregor in 1978. He defined transforming leadership as a process where leaders and followers raise one another to higher levels of morality and motivation. Look at the context of what these things, right? So everything was about the relationship, and the relationship being mutually convenient and mutually working together. And we are working towards these goals utilizing high ideals and values, high moral values such as liberty, justice, equality, peace, humanitarian. So this is why all the concepts of the civil rights movement, all of these leaders or leadership models were trying to say, okay, it can't just be justice for some and equality for some. It had to be justice and equality for all, peace and humanity. So leaders were supposed to appeal to those higher ideals and not the lower ideals such as fear, greed, jealousy, and hatred. So in a lot of instances, you'd notice that some leaders or some, especially if you look in politics, a lot of leadership is focused on fear and jealousy. Now, I'm going to make some statements here that maybe some of you, in Trinidad, for example, our politics is divided by race and it is divided by fear. Primarily because the Indian parties, or the so-called Indian dominant parties, are fearful of the African parties. Why are they fearful? Because there's a us and them ideology between them. We don't see ourselves as Trinidadian. We see ourselves as Indian or African, and that is rubbish. Because, at least from my perspective, but a lot of the way in which our leaders operate is to tell you, if you don't vote, they go gain power, and then they go get this and that. Who's they? Now, yes, Nathan.
Sorry, sir. My mic was
I-
also on.
I notice you keep on coming in and out. You having problems?
Yeah, my internet is getting problems.
Okay, I understand. But Nathan, as you open your mic there, I am making a statement there, and I'm hoping I'm getting a response from the class when I say that our country is divided based upon racial lines, and those race, right? So for those of you who don't know, race doesn't exist, right? You all know that, right? Race is a human construct. You all aware of this, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
Race is a human construct designed for what purpose?
Um,
To
for
divide
separation,
people.
To divide people for what purpose?
to rule.
To control. Right? Yes, and to rule. Because once you can control, you can manipulate and therefore control. So when we are utilizing a known failed system of differentiation for human beings as the motivation to keep part of the country Indo and another part of it as African, what are we doing to ourselves when we constantly are doing that division? And we are driven by fear and jealousy. Understand? And hatred, because that's where it gets to. So the idea is we need leaders around us who will go beyond those things. Because
I don't know. So yeah, I'm not too sure, but I think I was either hearing or reading somewhere that this whole division started in the when we was a colony by the British.
correct.
It's
It was a technique that was used in that at that point in time. Yes, you're very
Yeah.
correct, Nathan. If any of y'all here did history of the Caribbean in school, in secondary school?
No.
Okay, you might have done sciences, but anybody else who did social sciences, did you do history?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, we don't know if anybody listened, but we'll see. You can show by a hand, you can put your hand up if you did history when you were doing things. Of course, you probably hated history because it was a whole set of dates and stuff that you had to memorize and you had to remember this and remember that. But at the end of the day, what you're supposed to have taken note of really is how the history of our past has impacted upon our current circumstances today. The techniques that was utilized by the British to rule was to keep the population separated. And they used obvious racial, or what I would call, it's not even racial, ethnic divisions that existed because of the places that we originated from, simple differences between people to help create artificial barriers to keep us separated. And what ends up happening is that transformational leadership theory was developed to try and say, okay, we need to stop focusing on those kind of things and focus on the fact that we're all the same, and that we should try to appeal to those higher ideals. But again, context of our leadership here shows that we still sit on that older system of, you know, using our differences to define what we're doing. So the transformational leadership theories that emerged sees leadership as inseparable from followership, so that you can't do anything as a leader without followers, and similarly, followers can't do anything without leaders. So there's a correlation, a mutual coexistence between the two, and we should motivate each other to behave in the best manner possible. That's at the end of the day. All right, and in so doing, what a leader would also encourage is that he would encourage future leaders to come up from it. All right. So that's what that particular theory was. Let's see, do I have the other one? Yeah, so these are people who are credited as being transformational leaders. Each one of these individuals attempted to try to bring together different varying groups of societies together. So Lincoln here was looking at the North and the South in terms of the Americas, where you had this dichotomy between slave owners and people who wanted to be free. You also had Mahatma Gandhi, who was looking for separation and independence for all of India, and hated the fact that India was then subdivided into India and Pakistan, because the religion was used as the separating tool there in terms of Muslim and Hindu. And that was something, again, the British Empire was really good at creating those things. Here comes Chelsea Smith. JFK was trying to bridge the gap between the old generation and the new generation. Dr. Martin Luther King was obviously trying to bridge that gap between the perceived black and white in society. Of course, that was a huge thing. FDR was here transformational because he transformed the nation from pre-World War II to post-World War II and post-industrialization. So he was able to make a connection between those two time frames, and led, well, actually it was his responsibility to lead the United States into probably its ascendancy in the world economic power. Now, anybody recognizes this nun here? Mother Teresa? Yes, Constantine. Your mic's on, but I'm not hearing you.
So that's Mother Teresa.
Yeah, well, what is she trying to bridge the gap between? Transformational wise.
Poverty.
Well, not poverty, but she's trying to bring awareness to the issue of poverty and the fact that we are all humans, regardless of if we're sick. And that's why these guys are noted as transformational leaders. All right. Transformational leadership versus transactional leadership. You all are going to actually be dealing with this in one of your presentations. The variation between transformational to transactional. So at the end of the day, basically, transactional leadership is about leadership that is dependent upon providing motivation through transactions, such as, you get a bonus if you get this done and so on. So it means that the manager sets up transactions to facilitate motivation of one group of individuals to do something to achieve the goals of the organization. Whereas a transformational leader will be one who is going to motivate people through more of an intrinsic process to want to make something happen or to want to do something, to inspire people towards making transition and changes through the nature of the relationship that they develop. So that's at the end of the day in terms of the variation between transformational and transactional leaderships. It doesn't mean that the leader can't use both techniques, but it means that one technique tends to be more short-lived than the other one. And that as soon as the reward is removed, the appeal to do the transaction is going to be gone. So therefore, you might get the actions coming up. Whereas a transformational leader would probably have more lasting power if they're able to get the actions to be driven from a more intrinsic point of view. So people want to make these changes. They want to appeal to higher ideals and higher moral values. All right. Again, critical aspects of these theories was that one, the focus was kind of fuzzy, and it of course lacked very importantly specific variables to measure, and there was a lack of clarity across the board. Probably because of all the drugs they were smoking at the time back in the 70s. That's why they started dropping acid, doing heroin and all kinds of stuff. If you look at any movies like the one featuring the death of Bumpy Johnson. If you look at the series on Bumpy Johnson, anyway, you're familiar with these films I'm talking about? I could set these things as homework for you all to go and look at, you know. Bumpy Johnson, this guy's
Yes,
gonna
Godfather of Harlem.
right, Godfather Harlem. Then you had the one that Denzel Washington had done. American Gangster, I think it was.
Yeah, what's that?
He did he was the guy who came after Bumpy Johnson. Anyway, all of those movies during that period kind of illustrates what was happening in different parts of the United States. Now, the sad thing about it is we have here, if any of y'all can find it, it's on YouTube. Look for a film called BIM. BHIM. And look at that. It actually depicts life in Trinidad as East Indian and his emergence in crime and stuff. It's kind of a small small synopsis of what life might have been like in Trinidad back in the 70s. Trying to think about, there's a whole host of movies that you could look at. The Bank Job is another one with Jason Statham. It featured Malik. You all familiar with that guy, Malik? You all don't know Malik? Oh man. Anybody looked at The Bank Job with Jason Statham?
No.
Check it out. Go on. Well, again, homework. Go and look at some movies. All right, go and look at American Gangster. Go and look at if any of you all could ever find a film called The Killing Fields. That's about Vietnam and the aftermath of Vietnam. Forrest Gump. Go and look at some of those transitory films that try to capture America. And if you can find them on YouTube, it's still on YouTube. Go and look at that. That's with Ralph Maraj. He played a young Bim. Look at those movies because they depict life at that particular time. At least depict a version of life during that period of time. And you kind of get an idea of what life was like and the context in which some of these theories developed. Which is why I laugh when I said the criticism of the theory is that it lacked overall clarity and specificity. And that's because I said they were probably smoking too much weed back then, right? So that might be why. All right, so let's move on. So what leader theory actually is very similar, where the function of the leader is to serve the membership. So the focus now is kind of like reverse. So if you're in the leadership position, your job as the leader was to serve the followers to ensure that they themselves can take charge of the organization and move it forward. All right, and therefore transform the next set of followers into the leaders. So that's the nature of the servant leadership thing. So the servant leadership views institutions with CEOs, staff, directors, and trustees all play a significant role in holding their institution in trust for the greater good of society, which is the reciprocal nature of this leadership process. So basically, the idea was, we are not long for this world. So therefore, whatever I do, I must help to prepare the next group coming forward to be able to look after it and to move it forward. So I'm just the custodian of this world until the next set, which is, to a point, is a good thing, you know, if you think about it from that perspective. So that's at the end of the day, that's what this theory is. Peter Block had his version 1993. So it's kind of like more of a as I said, a role reversal for the leader. The leader is really a servant to the membership. Again, you all are going to look at this in one of the DAF chapters in a little more detail. So I just want to tell you about it in general in terms of what this theory is all about. Again, however, this theory is, again, a bit hazy as well. Then you have the followership theory, which is very similar to the previous set of theories that we were looking at with the servant leader. Followership theories, followers have been viewed in the leadership literature as sheep in need of a leader. In redefining, Kelly redefined the followership and leadership rejects the industrial model in which leaders are superior to followers, but defines the role of the leader and the followers as having equal importance but relatively different activities. So again, in the followership theory, it sort of balances or brings it to the forefront the importance of followership. So the industrial models that we looked at from before in terms of the behavioral approach, the situational, the other theories that came in the 60s and 50s, again coming out of the industrial revolution. These theories are spinning things around and saying, okay, no, it's important that the followers become more responsible. So I think we looked at this the thankfulness, the alienated, the sheep, the S people and stuff like that. The different types of the Kelly's followership pattern. We looked at that in the previous presentation, so that you saw that one there. Effective followers. So we talked about this. Effective followers have these types of qualities: courageous, honest, they're able to build on their competencies, focus on their efforts, manage themselves, but committed to the organization's purpose, principles, and persons outside themselves, all those kind of things. And again, it's about a reciprocal nature, co-adventurers kind of behavior. So again, the followership theory is about both parties working together to be able to move the organization forward, and each one holding each other accountable, and each one holding each other up to behave in ethically, well, in high ethical behaviors. That was a very important thing. So 1991 describes the leadership theories in the 20th century using the industrial paradigm model. So again, the industrial paradigm really was about the Industrial Revolution. So everything, again, in the 50s and early 60s, you found that the industrial approach to things was important. So the methodology that was utilized to observe management behavior followed that paradigm, the industrial paradigm model that was going on there. So it was really important that the shift take place, because leadership theory in the 20th century mirrored the industrial era, in that the theories were structurally functionalist, management oriented, personalistic, and focusing only on the leader, goal achievement dominated, self-interested and individualistic in outlook, male-oriented, utilitarian and materialistic and ethical perspectives. So again, the only thing that mattered was maximizing production and earning the most profit, and rationalistic, technocratic, linear, quantitative, and scientific in language and methodology. Now, I actually had the opportunity to read some of those theories that came up, like the contingency theory. That I read a text on that contingency theory, and everything was couched in math and methodology. And it was the most annoying read I have ever come across. Tried to do graphs and do you all did statistics, not yet probably. So they did variance analysis and they did scatter charts and all kind of one pile of rubbish to try and prove that these behaviors led to higher outputs, greater profits, and yada yada yada. It was really nonsensical. It was reading it in the context of what leadership is. So he's talking about leadership programs transitioning out of that paradigm in the 70s into the more followership, transformational leadership type of interest that they talked about, that we met in the latter part there. So those are transformational concepts where the focus now is on the persons and the relationship. It's also not male oriented because everybody can be leaders, and it opens up a whole different pathway that we're looking at. And they talked about the nature in which the world is changing. So that paradigm. So let's look at where we're heading now. Faced with unprecedented economic, technological, socio-political, and moral, ethical, tumultuous sea of change, there's a need for new theories, new applications, and just a plain new way of thinking about leadership. That's 2004. All right. So here we're dealing with a circumstance or a situation where things are changing rapidly. And it's not the easy-going methodology that we looked at before. So this is going to start to move us out of that hairy-fairy movement of the 70s and latter part of the 80s. Well, the 80s is more of the 80s of excesses, right? And 90s, all those areas. So in comes a world in which we don't have as much control as we thought we would. A world filled with chaos, but one in which chaos is viewed as something to be embraced rather than feared. To successfully navigate this world, new maps are needed, maps describing that leadership that is needed in an era of rapid change. Now, that's something that we need to talk about. So here we come across the concept of chaos theory. Now, chaos theory is propagated upon the concept that the world is not as predictable as we would like it to be. But in that unpredictable, or what we see as being unpredictable activities, there is a hidden pattern that exists. But it is important for us to be calm and therefore observe those patterns, because if we are rushing around dealing with basically putting out fires, then we are unable to take stock of the pattern that emerges. All right. So this view of the world as turbulent, ever-changing, risky, and always challenges echoed and expanded in some of the recent work describing the quantum or chaotic world, right? So this is where chaos theory comes up. And it says, okay, so the world is not this simple hairy-fairy, you know, how can I put it? Boy meets girl, boy marries girl, boy has children, you know, that kind of stuff. That linear type of approach to life. It's not going to be like that, unfortunately. All right. So what they're saying here in this theory is that we have to make some assumptions. One, you cannot control everything around you. And that's a hard thing. Any of you all suffer from AD, what's that thing where you have to control the environment around you? Things have to be in a particular manner all the time. God, I always remembered, and I kind of have that myself.
Is it OCD?
OCD. I don't know why I always say A, because that's another one too. If you are OCD, this is not a nice part of the presentation, because when you have OCD, you can't manage this because the world is never going to operate the way you would like it to. It doesn't ever operate the way it does, and therefore, trying to tell somebody who suffers from OCD and wants to make sure that this is this way and that is at a right angle triangle and the world around you is organized. This statement here, it is a world that cannot be controlled, is a dangerous phrase for somebody telling them that that's the case that they're going to have to face. So when you are dealing with a world of chaos, chaos theory tells us that we need to have some basic concepts to operate. We need to be sensitive to initial conditions. Also called the importance of initial conditions, implies that how something begins greatly determine where it ends. So we have to be paying attention to when a change takes place. We have to look at what was the initial condition. So that's an important element. Then we have to make relationships and connections between well, not only the what took place, because we have to map those connections, cause and effect all the way through. But we also have to rely upon relationships and connections with other people to be able to find solutions and ways of getting things done. So the connections that they keep on talking about is referred to as the concept of andness, in that you can't be going, it's either this or that. You have to say, to find a solution, you literally have to and together a number of different options to find something that will actually work. Because in a place or in a world where there's a massive amount of problems, a world of chaotic issues that's taking place, no one solution will be able to fix the kind of problems that we face. So, for example, we talked about the issue of, well, somebody had brought up the issue of crime in Trinidad and Spain, and that being one of the issues that we would like to see solved. Think about how chaotic the world is outside there. You have lots of different criminal activities or crimes taking place. So when somebody comes up and says to you, the solution to crime is to bring back the death penalty, I would say that's a very simplistic thing, because how does the death penalty stop? How does that stop robbery? You know, how does that stop? How does it help prevent a whole compendium of crimes that don't carry the death penalty? No, well, the thinking here is, well, if the death penalty was working and people were being punished and they were being killed, or executed as a result of the crimes that they committed, then they'll send a message to everybody else to that crime no pay. Unfortunately, the evidence doesn't indicate that. All right. So if any of you want to go and do the research, you'll realize that those states that have the death penalty in the United States also have the highest murder rates. So obviously, the death penalty is not doing what they think it ought to be doing. It's not serving as a lesson. All right. Something else has to be done. That's why when you're working in a chaotic environment, there's no one solution. That's why the concept of andness and anding is going to be something that you'd have to be dealing with all the time. Because in order to find one solution, it might be made up of part of one thing that is partially correct and partially wrong, and then add something else that is partially correct and partially wrong, and together they can maybe become a solution or the beginning of a solution to fix a broader problem. That makes sense? So we have to shift away from simplistic approaches to complex issues and complex problems. Crime in Trinidad and Tobago is not a simplistic issue. We can't simply just put one thing in place to get rid of crime. And even people who come from a criminal background will probably try to make that argument that, yeah, just have to do this by that. No, the criminal situation we face today is miles different to what you might have thought it was in the past. And if you really sit down and think about it, there's no one solution that can be found. And you can't depend only on one set of individuals to solve the problem that exists. So again, start to think about the world in chaos and start to think about how do we arrive at a situation there to get to the problem, to get to a solution. So this is where the chaos theory is telling us we have to be patient. We have to pay attention to what caused the situation, follow what is the cause and effect as we keep on going along. And we have to be looking for compound solutions, not a what I would call not a binary, but a simplistic approach to a very large problem. So what you're looking for is, you see what it says here, multiple partial solutions to a big problem. And that problem is not just one element in itself. To be able to deal with the problem, we'd have to actually clearly identify what the problem is to move forward. Because the problem that we are facing in terms of climate change is made up of a number of different, a number of issues that is causing the problem, right? There's no one thing that has brought us to this position where we are now. It's a number of things over a long period of time that has caused the issues that we're talking about, some of which we can't dismantle because it means dismantling our very way of life at this point in time. Okay, so you'll be more likely to come up with some possible answers and begin solving a problem if you have multiple methods or multiple solutions to approach it. All right. Most problems facing communities, groups, and organizations are difficult and have no simple answers. If there is a simple answer that seems obvious, it will have been tried sometime in the past and may or may not have succeeded. Because of the complex natures of these problems, partial solutions may be all you can be expected to develop. But you will be surprised at how much several partial solutions can accomplish. That's what I was talking about before. In order to get things fixed, it may not be necessary for us to use just one methodology, but a number of different technicals. So the problem again with the chaos theory is that it's vague and it's very difficult to nail down because the system is asking us to be very flexible in our nature, flexible in our relationships, flexible in the behaviors that we keep on talking about. So those are the chaos theory is actually referring or creates that problem. So again, the problem with chaos theory is that as I said, it's very loose and it's very what's the word they were using? The word is nebulous. Yeah, it's kind of vague in its thinking. All right. And that if you leave things on their own, they will eventually sort themselves out, which means a pattern will emerge in the apparent chaos that will fix the solution. And that pattern is there. It's just because of the amount of change that is taking place all at once, it's difficult to see and difficult to observe. The idea of sitting and looking carefully and observing in itself is almost like a passive approach to the thing, but it's what they're talking about. But it's highly unlikely that that will happen, because in a lot of instances we need reactions, we need to be able to do things. So there's a problem in terms of that. Another model that was developed is called the authentic leadership model. So this is a newer model, and this focuses on the authentic leadership models, focuses on the fact or the issue that was brought up, that a lot of leadership that we see around us today seems to be devoid of moral and ethical standards, and that the behaviors of our leaders seem to be very materialistic in nature, selfish and self-oriented, and tend to be focused only on how I, both as a leader and as a participant, can benefit from it. So authentic leadership is trying to speak to a truer form of leadership in which you are asking both all participants who engage in this style of leadership to engage in it with a more altruistic view in terms of how things are going to be, how they're going to work out. All right. So in order for this type of leadership to grow or to start, you have to start with authentic people. And authentic people give rise to authentic leadership. So that the descriptor here that they utilize for authentic leadership is a leadership as a confluence of positive psychological transformational leadership and moral ethical leadership. The authentic leader as someone who is confident, hopeful, optimistic, resilient, transparent, moral or ethical, future-oriented, and gives priority to developing associates to be leaders. So this is the authentic leader that they're talking about. And to be honest with you, this is again a very what's the word I want to use? It's a very optimistic model, but again, it's a model that like with all models, they present an ideal against which we measure the reality around us. But it emerged because of the number of leaders that emerged, that arose historically around us, that prove themselves to be thieves, especially in the financial field, cheaters in the political field, people who were very self-aggrandizing, again, mostly from the political and business fields. Those leaders have placed a lot of, and then you also have religious leaders who have affected this, who have proven to be very self-centered and some very dangerous and evil in their thinking. So the concept of it is that as we look around at various leaders around us, there's been a great level, a large amount of distrust that's been developed because of what we've been seeing happening around us. Leaders have been caught stealing money and resources. They've been cheating people. They've been manipulating people to get things that they want. The only reason why they're involved in those types of things is because they want something out of the activity. You know, they're not going in it there to help fix problems, but ready to fix themselves kind of situation. And in so doing, they take advantage of less you know, of people that they can manipulate in the situation. It's been a lot of sexual harassment that's been going on, especially with some of the male leaders in places. A lot of and a lot of people just there without the necessary skills, pretending to be a leader, pretending to know what they're doing, and in fact just making a mockery of other things. So authentic leadership, though very optimistic in mind, is laying down a foundation of an idealistic approach to looking at things. And of course, that in itself is a problem in terms of setting those values. Now, the idea would be, well, why do we need to create a theory called the authentic leadership model that is so, unbelievable? And the point about it is that, like with anything, a model is a model, and it's a gauge in which we can try to move towards. So authentic leadership, regardless of how optimistic it appears to be, and almost sometimes what some people refer to as very kind of pie in the sky type of thing. It is a something that we can aspire towards, a goal in which we can aspire towards. So it speaks to a lot of things that are good for us to have, characterized by, for example, followers and leaders, characterized by transparency, openness, trust, guidance towards worthy objectives, not very selfish objectives, emphasis on follow development. So all of these things are based upon trying to or creating a theory that is extremely optimistic in nature in relation to the nature of what was happening with leadership at this point in time. The 2005, coming out of 2000, we are coming out of a period where you had a whole set of scam artists going on. You had a lot of international what do you call them, Ponzi schemes coming up, and you had leaders behaving in very unethical ways. All kind of, it's still going on now. So the whole idea is that this model emerged as an alternative to the inauthentic type of leaders we were seeing in practice around us. And that kind of even Donald Trump came up in this thing where, he obviously is not trained, has, very narrow view of how to get things done, very selfish methodologies and sort of trying to do this. So the idea was that authentic leadership came up as a model, but again, problem with this model is that it's kind of airy-fairy and doesn't give you, hard things to measure to. So we will need to look at another theory in relation to that. All right, so kind of wrapping up here. So it's at the end of the day, leadership theory is trying to capture something that is intangible. And the theories are trying to describe, like everything else, human behavior. And human behavior is a very difficult study. The problem with human behavior, for any of you who are social scientists, is that human behavior is unpredictable from a granular point of view. But from a group behavior is much more predictable. Simply because the majority of people will operate in a similar manner. But when you're talking about a leader is an individual in that group. So that's why I refer to it as granular in nature. Therefore, it is difficult to say this theory will explain this particular leadership behavior, because now you're speaking to the behavior of one person. Now, one person's behavior can generally be predictable if the stimulation remains constant. But if things change, then there's a great likelihood that the behavior begins to get a bit unpredictable, or can become a little what's the word I want to use? A little, they can just be going all over the place, that type of stuff. So the focus of leadership theory to try and explain how individuals will behave in the midst of a group of other individuals, of course, probably puts us in a very problematic situation. That is why the vast majority of leadership theories often result in this phrase down here: inconclusive and ambiguous types of findings when you try to apply sciences to it. Now, you have a whole pile of different theories that emerged. The chaos theory being the last one, which is, for those of you, if you ever get a chance to read that section on the chaos theory and its approach to management, if you have OCD, you can't be, it feels icky to be able to read that and try to think about developing a life and leadership in that context, because everything is just changing so rapidly. So the challenge that we face at this point in time is how do we look at the relational leadership model and how it encompasses all of these different models into the development. And the last one that it actually pulls from will be the last one that will emerge, called the authentic leadership model. So we're going to see how it tries to get into all of these things. So I put a last phrase down here. So it's a long presentation, but at the end of the day, you don't need to memorize any of the information. What I'm just trying to put together here for you guys is the story of how leadership has arrived at where it is and how the models emerged throughout time, and the connection with what was taking place or what is taking place in the world at that point in time, and the influence it has on the people's the people who are writing these theories or creating these theories or doing the research for it, how it impacts upon their thinking, behavior, and what the conclusions that they actually come up to. So I don't have any exams to stress on, so don't get carried away or worried if you didn't quite grasp any of them. But what I want you to look at is the rich history of the study of leadership. All right. Okay, so are there any questions? I mean, it's a long chapter, so have a look at it if you can. And do you have anything you want to ask or comments you want to make? Observations that you, yeah, go ahead.
Which theory you agree with the most?
Me? The
Yeah.
one that we are going to look at, the relational leadership model.
Okay.
Next week, that is what I'm going to present to you. I'm going to present to you the relational leadership model. That's what the theory I actually like the most. The others kind of explain our behaviors and stuff like that. But it doesn't really, it doesn't let's put it this way. A lot of it is still too hairy-fairy. So you see that last theory that we were looking at, the authentic leadership theory. I like that theory, but honestly, I don't think it'll work in our world as it exists now. We kind of have to develop that thinking because it's so idealistic in nature. The chaos theory scares me. That chaos theory scares the living daylights out of me.
I don't know, sir, but I kind of noticed that pattern with some of the theories, like some of the ideas from like other fields of science just dominate the leadership studies, because like the grand leadership theory with the eugenics and the even the chaos theory, because that is physics.
Correct.
Like
Quantum comes out of quantum physics. Yes, you're right. Yeah, and that's what I'm saying is that whatever is the prevailing thinking at any particular time, it influences the research and the behavioral sciences approaches to trying to explain leadership theory. So the reason for that sometimes it's better to develop a theory in conjunction with ongoing thought process, so that there's a connectivity, or the term they'd like to utilize is there's a nexus between current technology, current thinking, and the theories that arise out of it. But at the end of the day, they're all going to be behavioral theories, huh? Because they have to approach trying to explain behaviors of human beings in the context of operating as leaders. And the focal point that they're trying to make, well, we're going to see in the relational leadership model next week, is the importance of the relationship between the two. And that is going to be the most important element that we have to pay attention to, the nature of the relationship. All right. Okay. So I think I have about 8:15 in the too bad. So anybody has anything they wanted to ask, questions, clarifications? I need somebody here said who has to stay back and speak to me. I don't know, Mr. Constantine. All right, I just want to go over the course outline with you just to make sure you understand everything. All right.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So if that's the case, then I would wish everybody good night, except Mr. Constantine, who will hang back with me. I will turn off the recorder now.